Welcome back to Hearts on the Frontier, where the forgotten stories of the Wild West are brought back to life. If you love emotional, dramatic, and powerful stories from the frontier, make sure to stay with us until the very end, because today's tale is one that will stay in your heart for a long time. This is the story of a farmer who lived alone for many years, until the day he made a decision that changed everything. A decision that brought into his life the last Apache woman left behind after a tragedy that wiped out her people. Their meeting was unexpected, their connection improbable, and their journey one of the most unique in the history of the American frontier. Our story begins on the wide, sunburnt plains of Arizona Territory, around the late 1800s. Days stretched long like the endless horizon, and the wind carried the scent of dust, sagebrush, and old memories. In a small, isolated ranch stood a wooden cabin, simple, sturdy, and weathered, much like its owner, Charles Bennett. Charles was a man shaped by silence. He rarely visited the nearest town except for supplies, and he spoke to almost no one. Years before, he had suffered a loss no man should ever endure, the deaths of his wife and unborn child during a harsh winter. Grief carved deep lines into his face, and solitude became both punishment and comfort. He worked the land, mended fences, fed cattle, and watched the seasons change without speaking a full paragraph to another soul. People in town whispered that he preferred the company of the wind to the company of humans. But that silence was about to break. One late afternoon, just before sundown, Charles rode into the small settlement of Dry Creek for supplies. The town was buzzing, far more than usual. Dust swirled in the air, voices gathered in clusters, and tension crackled like lightning in a dry storm. He tied his horse near the general store and walked toward the crowd, curious but cautious. That was when he heard it, an auction. At first, Charles thought it was livestock. Ranchers often sold cattle or horses. But when he moved closer, pushing past townsfolk, his heart froze. It wasn't animals being auctioned. It was a woman. A young Apache woman stood on a wooden platform, bound at the wrists with rough rope. Her long black hair hung tangled around her shoulders, her clothing torn, her face dusty and bruised. But her eyes, dark, sharp, and alive, held a fire stronger than anything Charles had seen in years. She stood tall, proud, unbroken, even in chains. The auctioneer shouted her story to attract buyers. She was the last survivor from a small Apache band that had been wiped out during a recent conflict. The cavalry had taken her in, then handed her over to the town for disposal, as the man crudely put it. She was alone, left behind, and the town saw her as property. A heavy silence settled over the crowd. Some looked at her with hostility, others with curiosity, a few with cruel intentions. Charles felt something awaken inside him, a mix of guilt, sorrow, anger, and perhaps something deeper. He knew this wasn't right. He knew what loss looked like. And this woman, standing so fiercely against humiliation, stirred something he thought had died long ago. The bidding began. At first, men made jokes, shouting low, disrespectful offers. Her fate seemed sealed, until Charles stepped forward and quietly placed the highest bid. The crowd turned to look at him, shocked. Charles Bennett, the quiet widowed farmer who barely spoke, had bought the last Apache woman left behind. As she was handed over to him, the Apache woman stared straight into his eyes. No fear, no gratitude, only defiance, blazing bright and unwavering. Charles cut the ropes from her wrists immediately, surprising her. The auctioneer protested, saying she might run. Charles responded with a calm, steady voice, the kind he hadn't used in years. She's not property. The crowd murmured. The tension thickened, but no one challenged him. Charles gently gestured toward his horse. The woman hesitated, clearly untrusting, but she followed, walking with that same silent pride. Her name, he later learned, was Ayanna. The first days on the ranch were tense. Ayanna kept her distance, sleeping outside the cabin beneath the stars, refusing food unless it was left somewhere she could take without feeling watched. She avoided Charles whenever possible, and she said nothing at all. He respected her silence. After all, he knew what it was like to lose a world. Charles continued with his daily routine, pretending nothing had changed, feeding the livestock, repairing fences, working long into the hot evenings. He left fresh water near where she slept, left extra blankets when the nights grew cold, and placed food where she could take it without feeling cornered. Slowly, very slowly, Ayanna began to watch him, studying the quiet man who never raised his voice, never touched her, never tried to confine her. One morning, Charles found that the cattle troughs had been cleaned and refilled before he even woke. Ayanna was standing near the barn, arms crossed, as if daring him to question her. He didn't. Instead, he simply nodded in acknowledgement. For the first time, her expression softened, not fully, but enough to show she noticed the gesture. Days became weeks. Ayanna began helping with chores, not because she was asked, but because she chose to. She mended torn sacks, gathered firewood, and even helped guide stray cattle back to the pasture. Charles never asked why. He treated her as if she belonged, not as a servant or token, but as another soul surviving the harshness of the frontier. One evening, during a fierce desert storm, lightning cracked across the sky, and thunder rolled so violently it shook the cabin. Ayanna, who had always slept outside under the open night sky, stood at the doorway drenched. Charles opened the door fully and stepped aside, offering her a warm place by the fire without a single word. She hesitated, then entered, shivering. For the first time since arriving, she allowed herself to sit beside him. They shared silence, comfortable, meaningful silence. Charles handed her a blanket. She accepted it. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, something gentler began to grow. Over the next months, Ayanna began teaching Charles small words in her language. She drew symbols in the dirt, showing him meanings, stories, fragments of memories from the life she lost. In return, Charles taught her how to ride his calmest horse, how to plant winter crops, how to mend saddles. They built communication from gestures, looks, and slow, patient trust. But the peace they found didn't last forever. One summer afternoon, a group of men from town arrived at the ranch, men who had been at the auction. They claimed Charles had no right to keep Ayanna. They said she should be returned, though everyone knew their intentions were far darker. They wanted to take her and do what many cruel men had done to native women during those years. Charles stood his ground. He placed himself in front of Ayanna and faced the men with a calm but fiery determination. The men mocked him at first, but when Charles refused to move, tempers flared. Ayanna stepped out, standing proudly beside him. Her presence alone unsettled the men. They weren't expecting her to display strength or connection. Charles told them she wasn't going anywhere. The confrontation escalated. One man raised his gun. Charles's heart pounded. Before he could react, Ayanna threw a rock with such precision that it struck the man's wrist, knocking the gun from his hand. The men cursed and retreated, vowing to return. That night, Charles cleaned the cuts on Ayanna's hand, asking gently why she risked herself. For the first time, she spoke to him in English, her voice low but firm. "You stood for me. I stand for you." Those 5 words changed everything. The next few weeks were filled with a deeper connection, growing naturally like roots beneath desert soil. They shared stories, not many, but enough. Charles told her about his wife, his unborn child, his grief. Ayanna spoke of her people, of songs she could no longer hear, of loved ones lost. Their sorrows mirrored each other, yet their bond became something healing. But danger returned in the form of a second visit, this time with more men, angrier, armed. They insisted that Ayanna belonged to them. Charles stood his ground again, but it was clear the odds were different now. Ayanna refused to hide. Together, they prepared the ranch, blocking windows, loading Charles's old rifle, planning for the worst. But something unexpected happened. Before the men arrived, a small group of cavalry officers appeared, responding to rumors of trouble. They questioned Charles first, then Ayanna. After a long, tense conversation, they concluded that she was free to live where she chose. They warned the townsmen that interfering again could bring legal punishment. Furious and humiliated, the men backed down for good. With the threat gone, life slowly returned to the quiet rhythm of ranch work, shared meals, and peaceful evenings. Ayanna began planting a small garden behind the cabin, filling it with medicinal herbs and flowers she remembered from her people. Charles built her a separate small room next to the cabin, but she rarely used it, choosing to sit by the fire with him instead. Season after season passed. Their bond grew into something wordless, deep, and respectful. It wasn't a story of rescue. It wasn't ownership. It wasn't a savior tale. It was 2 broken souls finding a way to rebuild life together, choosing each other freely. One cool autumn evening, While the sun dipped below the mountains, Ayanna placed a hand lightly on Charles's shoulder. When he turned, she met his eyes with a calm certainty. She spoke softly. "This land, this home, I stay." Charles felt a warmth spread through him, something he hadn't felt in years: hope. He nodded, unable to speak. For two people who had lost everything, choosing to stay was the bravest act of all. Years later, people in Dry Creek would speak of the quiet farmer and the proud Apache woman who built a life on the frontier's edge. They weren't a legend of violence or conquest. They were a story of survival, trust, and the powerful truth that sometimes the most unexpected bond becomes the one that saves you. Thank you for watching another story from Hearts on the Frontier. If you enjoyed it, leave a like, share this video, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories from the old Wild West. Until next time, stay safe, stay strong, and keep your heart open to the stories that shape the frontier.